I'm Ben Meiselas from the MeidasTouch Network, and this is a breaking news alert. A 26-year veteran United States Capitol Police officer was just convicted on one count of obstruction of justice in connection with the January 6th insurrection. He was charged with two counts, and on one count there was a conviction. On the other count there was a mistrial. 11-1, the jury was deadlocked in favor of conviction. We will see what the Department of Justice decides to do if they decide to retry the second count. But the Capitol Police officer in question is named Michael Riley. As I mentioned, he was a Capitol Police officer for 26 years. He was there on the date of the insurrection. He was actually one of the first officers, if not first officers, to respond to the pipe bombs that were at the Republican committee and the Democratic committee. But then after the insurrection, Michael Riley did something odd and very criminal. He had reached out to someone who he had followed on Facebook a few days before the insurrection, who he apparently had some things in common. They both like to fish and they like certain outdoor activities. And Michael Riley reached out to this individual by the name of Jacob Hiles because Jacob Hiles, right after the insurrection, was posting things about being at the insurrection and his involvement at the insurrection. And so Michael Riley contacted Jacob Hiles on January 7th and sent a direct message and said, hey, you need to change or take down your statements related to the January 6th insurrection. Michael Riley said that he agreed with Jacob Hiles' political beliefs and wanted to help out, so told Jacob Hiles to either alter the message or take it down. On January 8th, one of the first grand juries investigating criminal conduct in connection with January 6th was impaneled. And then later in January, Michael Riley, this Capitol Police officer who had already been contacted at that point by investigators, had told Jacob Hiles that he no longer believed Jacob Hiles' story. And in addition, Michael Riley then deleted all of his communications with Jacob Hiles, which federal prosecutors stated was done in an effort to try to cover his tracks for telling Jacob Hiles to remove these statements relating to the insurrection. And so Michael Riley was charged with two counts of obstruction. One count related to the January 7th Facebook message to Jacob Hiles telling him to take down the post or to change the post relating to the January 6th insurrection. And then another count of obstruction, which was once Michael Riley was contacted by investigators investigating the insurrection, Riley then deleted his communications with Hiles and then tried to cover his tracks by telling Hiles that he no longer believed Hiles' story about why he was in the Capitol building, which prosecutors said was Riley trying to cover his tracks. And so this was the first trial where there was a Capitol Police officer who was the criminal defendant in connection with January 6th. Then there was a successful conviction by prosecutors on one of the two counts, the count relating to the deletion of messages after Riley was contacted by investigators. The jury found unanimously that 12-0 to convict Michael Riley on obstruction on that obstruction count, but they deadlocked 11-1 over whether it was obstruction for Michael Riley to reach out on January 7th to essentially this stranger, Jacob Hiles, who he saw on social media, and tell him to alter the message about the January 6th insurrection. And from what we're learning about one of the jurors who were the holdouts, because the grand jury wasn't impaneled until January 8th, that juror was apparently, unsure about whether or not Michael Riley could have had the intent to obstruct a grand jury proceeding before the grand jury was actually impaneled. And what the prosecutors argued was, look, Riley was a Capitol Police officer. He knew a grand jury was going to be impaneled, and his intent there was to obstruct a grand jury which he knew was going to exist by virtue of the fact that he's a Capitol Police officer and he knows how these things work. But the obstruction count, oh, by the way, that was the only case so far. Just to show you how successful the Department of Justice has been, this has been the only jury trial so far by the Department of Justice in connection with a January 6th case where there was a mistrial on any of the counts. In every single other January 6th prosecution, on all of the counts, there have been convictions, and rather quick convictions reached by the jury. But as you see from that fact pattern that I gave here, the facts in this are odd. You have this 26-year-old veteran Capitol Police officer reaching out on social media to this insurrectionist, telling him to remove a post before a grand jury is impaneled. It's not like the basic fact patterns of an insurrectionist who shows up on January 6th and engages in conduct. By the way, if you were wondering, Jacob Hiles previously pled guilty to a misdemeanor for his conduct in connection with the January 6th insurrection. But the penalty that Michael Riley is facing for this one count is incredibly stiff. What we're talking about here is he could face a recommended sentencing range of at least 15 to 21 months in prison, but based on enhancements and the role as it relates to January 6th, we could be talking about a range of 27 to 33 months for telling this insurrectionist to remove to remove the post and for deleting his information from social media for these counts. And so nonetheless, justice has been served, here in my mind. I do think that the Department of Justice is going to retry the case. I mean, it was an 11-1 deadlocked jury. When I say retry it, just retry it on that remaining count regarding the January 7th communication. The other obstruction he was convicted on, and so that's not at issue. Or it's possible that the Department of Justice may just say, look, we got our conviction. It's a weird fact pattern here involving this Capitol Police officer, and even though this Capitol Police officer was clearly guilty, putting that case regarding that January 7th message, may be difficult for jurors to understand. But nonetheless, you have an example of the Department of Justice ensuring that the law is followed no matter who you are, whether you are a Capitol Police officer who engages in conduct like this and abuses their power. No one is above the law. And the Department of Justice, I think, proved it by prosecuting a case which, frankly, even for the other count, I think could be viewed as a difficult case. I think that Michael Riley was clearly guilty. I think he deserved to be convicted. But you see, when you talk about this fact pattern, like contacting a stranger on Facebook and telling the stranger on Facebook who he saw a post about the insurrection to change the post, and then Michael Riley then deleted his own messages relating to his communications with the guy. And so very strange fact pattern, but nonetheless, I mean, a horrible conduct by this officer, who shouldn't be called an officer anymore, by this felon, who will be serving a stiff prison sentence, who shouldn't, abused his power, abused his privilege, should frankly never be called an officer, who knew better, and abused the trust of the people and abused the trust of his badge. When this case was before Justice Amy Berman Jackson, we've been talking about Judge Amy Berman Jackson cases. I did a video earlier about someone by the name of Albuquerque Head, who was one of the very violent insurrectionists who was just sentenced to 90 months before Judge Amy Berman Jackson. Judge Amy Berman Jackson is a no-nonsense law and order judge and is not giving leniency at all to these January 6th insurrectionists, nor should they be showed any leniency at all. So I think we would see, with regard to Amy Berman Jackson sentencing, usually on the higher end of the sentencing guidelines and recommendations is where she goes. But we will keep you posted here on the MeidasTouch Network. Hit the subscribe button. We're on our way to 1 million subscribers thanks to you. Hit the subscribe button. And in addition to hitting the subscribe button, check us out at patreon.com/MeidasTouch, patreon.com/MeidasTouch. Until next time, I'm Ben Meiselas.
MeidasTouch is unapologetically pro-democracy. And look, we know you are too. So please make sure you check out our best-selling shirt and our best-selling gear, the unapologetically pro-democracy gear. And hey, while you're at it, make sure you check out my favorite shirt and one of our most famous designs, It Wasn't Rigged, You're Just a Loser, at store.meidastouch.com. That's store.meidastouch.com.